Okay, got it.
Thank you, Dr. Keating, for joining the Judaism Demystified podcast. For those who are listening, Dr. Keating has appeared on Ben Shapiro, PragerU, many other shows, Lex Friedman, one of my favorite podcasts. So without further ado, we're going to start with the first question. In your book, Losing the Nobel Prize, a prize which you describe as a golden idol, is a memoir of your journey, not just on a scientific level, but on a personal level. In one of your talks, you said searching for God was in a way searching for your father. Can you expand on this?
Yeah, so I had kind of an interesting, maybe tortured, not literally tortured, but very unusual background, upbringing that we'll get to, involving detours through almost all the major world religions, including, going to Zoroastrianism. No, I didn't do Zoroastrian. Mainly just Christianity and Judaism and atheism. But I think the real kind of novelty Hiddish. Can I use Hebrew words? You guys understand any Hebrew? Can I, do I divine from those little hats on your head that you understand some Hebrew? So the Hiddush, the novelty, the kind of insight that I had was that because I grew up without a father, and because because God is kind of viewed as a king / father, the antipathy that I felt from the fact that my father had actually abandoned me and gave me up for adoption along with my older brother Kevin, that was maybe being put on God as well as literally on my father, my biological father. And so I think it presented a block. And I always say like this, I almost said the late, not great Richard Dawkins, but he should live and be well. But Richard Dawkins always says things like, there's no such thing as a Christian child or a Jewish child. That's all nonsense because the child doesn't know what he or she is choosing. Let's ignore that. But I think it is true that you can have an atheist kid, a baby from birth, because if your mother actively kind of proclaims that there is no God, that God does not exist, that God is a fairy tale, no matter what, religion they used to be a part of or maybe never were a part of, it's almost impossible for a kid to turn around from a staunch militant atheist background, as my friend and colleague Lawrence Krauss declares himself to be. It's almost impossible to go from that and even be open to the notion that a God could exist. Not that he does or doesn't, but just that the scientific possibility could be admissible. So for those reasons, I think growing up with a very difficult relationship with my biological father, including being abandoned, left for adoption, put up for adoption, and then not being in touch with him for so many years, except almost surreptitiously perhaps, in that I knew he was a scientist. I knew he accomplished great things in mathematics, but I never knew specifically, what he was like as a person. I didn't actually know what he looked like for 15 years of my life, from age 7 to age 22, when we did reunite. And I think the reunification allowed me to then kind of reapproach the pursuit of God from a perspective of somebody who at least had some sort of a biological father later in life, not as a kid, not as a 7-year-old when I had been abandoned. So I think I came to it with a more mature perspective. In between then, I had become Catholic, then atheist, and then got back to my Judaic roots when I reconnected with my father later in life.
Awesome. And so, as you were talking about, you were raised Catholic by your stepfather. You even, I believe, spent a year as an altar boy. And one interview I listened to, you described yourself as a Baal Teshuva. And you mentioned how Judaism talks about how to act, not so much about what to believe, more about deed than creed. I'm just curious, how much has Judaism shaped who you are? And what made you decide to return to your roots after being an atheist? And how do you reconcile the tension between religion and your work as a scientist?
Yeah, so a lot of questions there. It's good to see I'm not the only podcast host who asks, 8-part questions, and I always get, kind of complained about for doing that, but I love it. So thank you. So the kind of first part of your question, how did I come, from these different perspectives to then come back and become a Baal Teshuva, which literally means master of return, penitent. I feel like that was almost natural for me in a sense. The actual inciting incident, the event, if you will, that made me become more connected to my Jewish roots again later in life as a 29-year-old was actually September 11th, 2001. Because I had realized when that happened that Judaism, and in particular Israel, were at the center of a massive conflict between forces that were dominating the world. And I realized I knew a tremendous amount about Islam because you almost couldn't know a lot about Islam at that period of time, and got kind of contradictory messages of what is it? What does it revolve around? What are its precepts? And then I had been, as you say, a Catholic altar boy when I was supposed to be taking bar mitzvah lessons at age 12. I was actually working living in Dobbs Ferry, New York, and practicing Catholicism. And that included serving as an altar boy. I'd been confirmed and baptized years before that, and I wanted to go all the way. And at age 12, that sounded like a great thing, going all the way, meaning becoming a priest. And I never had any negative experiences, God forbid, anything to do with all the scandals that the Catholic Church has been involved with. I didn't have any of that. However, so it was only a uniformly good experience. And because my mother married a Goy, a non-Jew, that's my stepfather, Ray, her family kind of not disowned her, but kind of withdrawn and separated a lot. It was very painful for her family, which are Jews. And my biological father, I should say, is also Jewish, or was Jewish. He passed away, unfortunately, about 14 years ago. But the upshot is that I realized I knew more about Christianity and Catholicism. I knew about atheism because I'd been an atheist. I knew about Islam, but I didn't know anything about Judaism. And as when I was studying for my bar mitzvah at age 12, when I should have been studying for my bar mitzvah rather, and I was an altar boy, I realized a couple of things. One, that, the Catholic Church I had looked upon, and the Christian church, Christianity in general, as kind of being derivative of Judaism, that it had a New Testament. Well, Jews had an Old Testament. Well, I realized, there's like New Coke, or, there's like some new thing, or like The Empire Strikes Back. They kind of did even better than Star Wars. And so my feeling was that as a kid, that anything that came around later would be new and improved. It would be better. They would have found the lacunae, the gaps, the flaws, the foibles, the problems, the inaccuracies and inconsistencies in the Torah. I didn't know it was called the Torah, but I figured it's, they got to come around as a scientist, just thinking logically. If there are flaws, they must have updated them, corrected them, and improved upon Judaism. That's what I thought. And then when I became aware that to become, I only like to do things all the way. I like to do things with, what do you call it? Zerizus, very, very passionate. That's one of my good traits. So I want to go all the way. Like as a scientist, I want to be a professor. I want to be an astronaut. I want to be a pilot. I want to do all these things. In Catholicism, I wanted to go all the way, which meant being a priest. Now at age 12, that was reasonable. I felt like I could do that. By age 13, as you may remember, something starts to happen, and you start to think about, well, what would be the implication if I went all the way in Catholicism? I'd have to be a priest, be celibate, take a vow of celibacy. And as a 13-year-old, kind of boy, that didn't seem palatable to me. On the other hand, I also felt at the same time that I wanted to, continue to investigate my love of science. And those two things, combined with the knowledge, or the supposition that Christianity was new and improved Judaism, with my knowledge about science, which was coming along at the exact same time, I realized that the church had actually treated my favorite scientist of all time, still to this day, Galileo, they treated him abhorrently. And I couldn't reconcile a religion that by that time, in the mid 1980s, late 1980s, had never forgiven Galileo for saying the truth that the earth goes around the sun and not the other way around. And that combined with the fact that allowed me to sort of start to second guess and reject Catholicism. At the same time, if you can reject, the logical law of logic, if, modus tollens, if A, then B, and A, then B. So I felt like, well, if Christianity comes after Judaism and there's a problem with Christianity, then all kol vachomer, there must be a problem with Judaism. So now I can just reject everything and I don't have to do anything. That's when I became an atheist. So those kind of things in the formative time of my life, becoming a scientist, kind of feeling that there are problems with Catholicism due to their treatment of my hero, Galileo, and feeling like that Judaism must have, been improved upon and I could reject it now as well, meant that by the time I hit my, 20s in college and late teens and was in college, I didn't have any religion to speak of. And it was only after September 11th when I realized that the Judaism was a mystery to me. I couldn't read Hebrew. I couldn't speak it Hebrew. Never gone to a real. Actually, I don't think I ever went to a temple ever in my life up until about age 28 or something like that. Certainly not an Orthodox synagogue. And so I think it was fresh to me. It was, and I'm only comparing myself to Albert Einstein because we're identical in every single way, brilliant. But Einstein said a very interesting thing, guys. He said, as a kid, I wasn't curious. I never asked my tati, Albert Sr. I never asked Daddy what would happen if you traveled at the speed of light and looked at yourself in the mirror. And he said that was a good thing, because if I asked my dad back in 1879 when he was 5 years old, if I asked Daddy what happens when I travel at the speed of light, he would have said, something that was known to be wrong, because it would only be 20 years later when Albert himself came up with it at age 25 in his miracle year. What happens when you travel at the speed of light is part of the theory of relativity. Mm-hmm. Similarly, and this is the only way I compare myself to Einstein, I also didn't ask questions about religion until I was in my mid to late 20s. And because of that, like Albert said, I approached it with the seriousness that no 5-year-old could even muster. And with me, it was the same thing. I could ask questions about Judaism from the perspective of a professional PhD scientist, but also revel in the behavioral aspects of it. I think Ben asked me that in the beginning, that I saw as unique to Judaism, whereas my faith in Christianity was only emunah, was only faith-based or kind of acceptance-based. There's no demands put on me. I had to wear like this robe or something as an altar boy, but people would come to church in flip-flops and heel, whatever. But I never felt like that was somewhere that I belonged until I did go to an Orthodox synagogue as a 20-year-old and start to learn Hebrew and read the Torah and took it from there. And ever since then, which is 22 years almost now, 21 years, I have been pursuing Judaism and learning and making my unique kind of interpretation of what it can teach me by way of what I actually practice.
Very fascinating. And as somebody who's obviously a proud Jew myself and somebody who learns Torah, the way we were always taught was to ask questions and to be curious. And we don't have I'm sure there are sects who are more like dogmatic, but generally speaking, we Jews, we look at the Torah as, something that we're open to evolution, for example, or the age of the universe being much older. We're not creationists or literalists like the Christians. There's an openness to Torah study. So that I really appreciate that you're approaching it that way. It's really an amazing thing. So I want to actually jump to another question. I'm not a scientist, so forgive my ignorance, but it seems like scientists today are reverting to the eternal universe model to avoid the implications of the Big Bang via the multiverse theory. So if that's the case, why do atheist scientists insist that if God were to exist, something must have created him? Yet the same logic doesn't apply to the universe. The universe itself doesn't need to have a creator. It just is. It always was, right? So it seems like science can also be, in a way, dogmatic religion. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely. Yeah. No, there's no one as religious as he who claims he doesn't have a religion, because that becomes identification. In fact, that's why most people nowadays will call themselves maybe agnostic, which means not knowable, rather than atheist, which means non-existent. God does not exist, because a good scientist realizes that's not tenable. You can't prove that God does or does not exist, right? We wouldn't get any credit. That's why it's called emunah, by the way, right? It's faith. I don't have emunah in gravitational fields, right? I know they exist. I have evidence for them. I don't have emunah that 2 + 2 = 4. I have a mathematical logical proof that 2 + 2, and actually it's 300 pages thick. It's not some trivial thing, but you follow certain laws, you accord by this logic, and you'll get this result. The issue with the multiverse is manifold, no pun intended. It arose from a desire to kind of answer what's called the weak anthropic principle. which is the notion that we exist in a universe that is otherwise pretty inhospitable. It's very unlikely to find the existence of living organisms, just to have a handful of different things that had to happen. We'd have to live on a rocky planet. We'd have to have water. That water would have to not cover the entire planet. We don't see dolphins making iPhones, right? So even though you could have life, you could have intelligent life, but you couldn't have technological life. And that's one of the sine qua nons of what humans are. We communicate. And in fact, the word, for human in Latin, where it comes from, Homo sapien, sapien means wisdom. Scientia, science, means knowledge. And as we know, Torah means wisdom. It doesn't mean knowledge, right? So I always like the fact that, Jews have as many names for like knowledge and wisdom and insight and intuition as the Eskimos purportedly have for snow, right? So it's integral to who we are. And same with love, right? I mean, we have different loves and we have different words for it, hesed, kindness, all those different, right? So it's a beautiful kind of descriptive thing. What the scientists will say, though, is even though it's not knowable to know if God exists, and a good scientist will say, I can't prove that God doesn't exist, they will act like God doesn't exist. So I had this conversation with a very famous scientist who's unfortunately has passed away, Freeman Dyson.
Yeah.
He was at the Institute for Advanced Study for many, many years in Princeton, one of the most brilliant people who ever lived. He was actually the first guest on my podcast, Into the Impossible, where I've had, as you mentioned, Ben Shapiro, Rabbi David Wolpe, many Christian thinkers. In fact, today in my episode, we're recording this in early to mid-January 23, the interview that I'm hosting on my channel today is with a professor in Western Sydney, Australia, Luke Barnes, who grew up as a young Earth creationist. His father was a pastor in a Christian church that believed the Earth is literally 5,000 years old. Which, be a fascinating thing, by the way, to talk about how you can view that as a scientist. I think technically it's very interesting. I don't know if it's appropriate for all audiences in this kind of capacity. But so Freeman Dyson would say things to me like, I'm an agnostic. And I'd say, Freeman, that's very interesting. What if there are aliens and they look down on Earth and they see you, Freeman? And he was a lovely man, British man, was almost 94, I think, when he passed away 3 years ago. And I said, it's a Sunday afternoon. And they see you, sitting at home, with a book and and drinking your British, English breakfast tea. How would they know that you're agnostic, not atheist, when they look next door at your countryman Richard Dawkins and they say, these two guys don't go to the same church, right? They're both not going to the same church. In other words, their behaviors are identical. Even though Freeman would say he's agnostic and Richard Dawkins would say he's an atheist. So that brings us to like, what is the Torah in terms of like, how does that differentiate itself from other religions and from other practices? In other words, can you really be an agnostic Jew? I know a lot of cultural Jews. I know a lot of Reform, conservative, Orthodox, but can you be an agnostic Jew? And the question, I think, is appropriate for a scientist, because as I said, we don't have proof that God exists, just like we don't have proof and can never construct proof that God doesn't exist. So what I see as my mission for me personally, and to those that, resonate with this message, is that I look as a scientist for clues, and the clues can point the direction to basing your evidence and making it more and more sturdy, but never knowing that you'll never be able to prove like 2 + 2 = 4. You'll never get to that level of credulity. But I ask questions about it, and I look at it not as a science book. And I think that's very important. When you look at, and I said this to Ben Shapiro when I was on his Sunday special, when you look at a book, the book, the title should tell you something about it. I have a segment of my podcast now called Judging Books by Their Covers. And you're supposed to never do that, but what else do you have to go on? You're like picking up this book. It's in the bookstore. You've got it here. Everybody should buy, multiple copies of this. This is my second book. This is my first book. Like, it should have something to do with the title and the cover. But we always say, oh, don't judge a book by a cover. No, you should. So let's look at the Torah, right? So you pick up the Torah. God forbid, Has v'shalom, I'm not comparing my book to the Torah. Pick up the Torah. Do you guys know how many verses are in the Torah?
I don't even know.
How many Pesukim are in the Torah?
No idea.
Rough approximation. 35,000 verses, about. Okay. You know how many verses are in Genesis 1:1 to 1:8 or something like that? It's about 35.
Yeah.
It's about 35. So that means 1 out of every 1,000 pages in the whole Torah and the whole all the Pesukim is about creation, Adam and Eve, the Garden of Eden, right? So now that you pick up this book and it says on it, it says history of the NBA, and it's only about 1,000 pages long. And there's 1 page about Michael Jordan and LeBron James and KD, and I don't know where you guys are at, but all those great basketball. And then the other 999 pages about that one Jewish guy who I think Amari Stoudemire converted to Jew. Anyway, this isn't like a really technically apt title for this, but it's really a history of like Jews in the NBA, of which there are very few. And so the Torah is clearly sort of sending us a message that it's not really a science book. And I think people get into trouble, especially scientists, when they say silly things like, oh, well, you wouldn't, like, we know that the earth is, they thought the earth was created on the 4th day, but what does the day mean?
Right.
Exactly. And so my point is that I want to find things as a scientist, non-scientific reasons to believe in the truth in the Torah. Because the signature of God is truth, right? That's a famous saying. Mm-hmm. On the same hand, you should also know how to answer an apikoros and know what to say when someone says something heretical, whether they're Jewish or not. You could be an atheist, Christian, but and say something that's just foolish, right? Like the favorite thing, they'll talk about slavery, or they'll talk about, killing your child, or they'll talk about, the women of ill repute. But these are very simplistic. Like I always say, people like Lawrence Krauss stopped learning. He actually had a bar mitzvah, and that's when he stopped learning about Judaism. So I say to people like that, Lawrence, would you accept a math or physics proof from a 12-year-old? Oh, absolutely not. They don't know anything. They need to get experience and wisdom and knowledge and pursuit. Well, why do you accept the refutation of the Torah's veracity from you, a 12-year-old version of you? Wow. And I think the kind of really long way of summarizing what you're saying, we as scientists look for reasons not to believe. Rabbi Kellerman has this book, Permission to Believe. But I think of it's like a lot of what scientists are looking for are pretexts to reject. And in so doing, they've come up with a lot of kind of torturous models and theories that are fine scientifically, 100% kosher. You can investigate the multiverse where there's infinite numbers of you and me, except you're on, the host of Into the Demystifying, and I'm the host of Into the Judaism podcast. There's literal infinite copies. So you can believe that. That's fine scientifically. But when you start to use it as a reason to say that there is no ultimate meaning, there is no purpose in life, there's no reason to behave by any moral or civil or practical code other than Darwinism, I think that's where scientists get into danger. And then we can get into the details and the quantum physics. I know your audience loves the quantum physics of the multiverse, but suffice to say, it's really, in a sense, invented to answer the question, which is, my mind, is unanswerable. And that's, why are we here? Science can't answer why questions. They can only answer how, what, when type questions.
Rabbi Sachs actually made that point. Rabbi Sachs made that point when he was talking to Richard Dawkins, that we're answering 2 different things. It's not just like you said. I actually want to point out we're kind of a Maimonidean, quote unquote, rationalist. I hate to use the term, but Rambam Maimonides has something very interesting about Aristotle, because he talked about the beginning, and Aristotle believed, obviously the Greek philosophers believed in an eternal universe, eternal world. And Rambam said, I believe that the Torah says that there's a beginning, so therefore there's a beginning. However, if beyond a shadow of a doubt it's proven that Aristotle is correct, then we must start to look at the word Bereshit, or in the beginning, as a metaphor, which is an astounding statement by Maimonides, because it really shows that our approach to truth is so powerful that we even would take the Torah and say, hey, you know what, we got to look at this differently. So I think that's an amazing part of our our whole religion, our belief system. It's so powerful. And I want to also mention one more thing that you said regarding emunah. Emunah, for those listening, it means faith, but actually it's kind of like a Christian version of the word.
Yes.
Torah, emunah, actually means faithfulness, like loyalty. There is no word for faith. There is no blind faith in the Torah. You see that God is, we have to know God, right? But the paradox is he's the unknown knower. You can't know God. Even Moses couldn't really know God. He can only see.
Lo yodati yediti, right? If I knew him, I'd be him.
Exactly. But the first commandment of the Ten Commandments is to know Hashem, right? So therein lies the problem. But the pursuit of knowledge of God, understand, looking for evidence, physical evidence, right? That's what Rambam says. You have to study science and everything like that. So, we very much, see eye to eye on this, because I think it's such an important message for our audience.
Yeah, and I think it's a unique message. So like my goal is that, I always say I'm a doctor, but I don't prescribe medication. But I do prescribe ways to kind of like Amuna vitamins. I think there's millions and millions of Amuna vitamins, and I give them to my kids. And one of the things I'll say is like, I don't know if you guys have kids, maybe you do, maybe you don't.
Yeah.
But like you see a rainbow, you see a keshet, like my kid, if my kid asks me and I say, oh, it's a miracle and it's beautiful. And it is a miracle. Don't get me wrong. It is a miracle, but to say that, to stop there, it's a miracle without saying, no, it's actually caused by electromagnetic radiation interacting with dielectric materials that are called water molecules that have this peculiar property. They act like these lenses that kind of bend things depending on their color. And it comes at a beautifully perfect angle. Or what's color, what's light? Oh, those are photons. What's the matter? Protons. What are they made of? Quarks. And then keep going and going. Where were those made? That was made in the Big Bang. And then what happened before that? Then you can say, only then should you say, we don't know. And maybe if you like, then that was God, right? In other words, don't short circuit. Do not stunt God's power too soon. Do not declare God and invoke God too early, because it will actually potentially, I'm not always, but it could stunt the kind of intellectual grasp, not only of the child's aptitude as a scientist, which is important, because all children are born natural scientists, as you know, if your parents, but also it limits the power of God, right? You're saying like God only made the miracle, right? Which is amazing, but like think of all the other miracles. I listed 6 other miracles that had to happen for that one miracle, quote unquote, to happen. Now, one of the reasons that appeals to me so much, and that I didn't really mention when I said about Islam, so I think it's important. Etymology is very important. When you look at Islam, it means in Arabic, it means to submit to God. And I always love the fact that Israel means to fight against God. And in fact, one of my kids is studying, Vayhi, I think, and he's talking, and we're also learning, in this week's parsha about Moses and encountering God, and yeah, you can't know God, but so you must get to God. Like if I show you a shadow on the wall, you could recognize, well, that could be some kind of a shape, and maybe it's moving, and maybe it's animated, maybe it's not, but you can get certain like glimmers or glimpses at it. But what I love is that you don't stop. Like God is almost encouraging us not to, not to have, I don't want to say not to have blind faith, because I know my rabbi is going to listen to this, and he and I argue about the rainbow thing I just said. And it's always in good faith and good humor. But I think there is something anathema to a scientist to say, oh, just stop at the miracle explanation. We always want to know more. But I think the humility of a scientist needs to say at a certain level, look, I don't know. God might be the real answer behind everything. God may not, behind this particular phenomenon. But to have the humility as a scientist is very hard to say, I don't know. And those are the most important words to say as a scientist, because otherwise you do have this almost hubristic attitude that you are like a all-powerful, omniscient deity, which is an easy trap to fall into.
Right, and then you can fall down the trap of the God of the gaps. And I think that science and religion, they try to find truth just from different angles. I think you just mentioned Rabbi Sachs. Yeah. I think you said that that science takes things apart to see how they work, and religion puts things together to see what they mean. And I think if we can keep that in mind, we will be able to do well in both.
And it's not,
and just with regard to Maimonides, who obviously is a towering, a titanic figure in my life, and in every devoted Jew's life. At the same time, he was kind of battling a different battle at that time. As you said, he was kind of the Hellenistic, approach, which must have been very awkward, right? Because we have Hanukkah, we have the story of the Hellenism, the attempted Hellenism, which wasn't really just to like kill Jews as a pogrom or something. It was really just to like have multiple gods. Like you can still have Hashem, it's fine, it's cool, but you got to take Poseidon, whatever that, right? But at the same time, the Greeks. So I learned something very recently when I was in Italy at a conference. There were a tremendous number of Jews Unfortunately, I was one of only two that were not Messianic Jews, and we can get into that and what that did to me. But on the other, for the other side of the fence, looking at the Greek influence, I wondered, for example, because it was in Galileo's old hometown, right, favorite hero of science in Florence, and I always wondered, why did the church, the Catholic Church, why do they care that Galileo was going against a pagan, which was Aristotle, right? Aristotle believed polytheistically, right? So why would they care that Galileo was overturning the works of a pagan? Like, they should be cool. He's just showing the superiority of monotheism. And because Galileo is actually pretty devout. Both of his daughters were nuns, etc. So he was a good Catholic and he believed in God. Many quotes to support that. Totally unambiguous, unlike Einstein, who had, things on both sides of the fence. But while I was there, I learned from a Christian scholar that God actually, or that Christianity or the Catholic Church, the Pope, canonized Aristotle after St. Thomas Aquinas in the 8th century or something like that, sort of brought to the attention of the, kind of pre-Enlightenment, the works of Aristotle. So he became post facto a Christian. And therefore, it made it anathema for Galileo to challenge the word of a Christian saint. So I thought that was really fascinating. But I've never felt the need to really adhere to, what the Catholic Church, in other words, here was Maimonides, Rambam, confronting and trying to understand and interpret Aristotle. Well, Aristotle, actually, there was almost nothing that he got right about scientific facts, other than the fact that whales are mammals. Literally, he thought heavier things fell faster than lighter things. He felt like there were 4 elements when there's 113. He felt like, for a divinely inspired guy, he got a lot wrong. And so I've never really, like, if I could, I feel like if I could sit down with Rambam and get him on my podcast after he goes on your podcast, I'd say, why were you so obsessed with like reconciling the Torah with this guy who we know was wrong literally 99% of the time about things that mattered in terms of scientific empiricism, not logic. He was very good poetics. He's very good, and even the pre-scientific method. So anyway, that's a long-winded way of saying I think we are still too influenced by non-Jews. I think as Jews pursuing and worried and thinking about scientific matters, where we might tend to be, we believe the universe is this old and the Torah says this. I think a lot of that comes from Christianity. And a lot of these things, maybe we shouldn't feel so guilty about.
Totally.
Oh, yeah.
We have enough to feel guilty about. We don't need that.
That's right. Got Jewish mothers.
Yeah, I mean, regarding also what you said about the Rambam, I mean, I think definitely Aristotle, the philosopher, had more of an influence. Rambam was very openly saying, if science is disproven, make it known. Not like, I'm not married to these ideas and you shouldn't be either. Because in Judaism, we have Mesorah. Our Mesorah is halakha. And halakha is, our tradition is halakha. That cannot be changed. Well, matters of science in the world, that will change, that will evolve, that'll, we can go back and forth on it, and it's not a problem.
100%. Yeah. Yep, that's right. Yeah, and in fact, it's an important distinction to make. In math, 2 + 2 will never be changed. It'll never be wrong. In science, Einstein is wrong. We know Einstein is wrong right now. We know that Newton was more wrong. And there's a famous saying by Isaac Asimov, I named one of my sons after. Wow. A great writer, thinker, sci-fi author. I love him. And he said, if you think the earth is flat, you're wrong. And if you think the earth is a sphere, you're also wrong, but you're less wrong. In other words, science is all about not proving. You cannot prove that the earth is a sphere. It's actually not there's no unique shape that describes it, right? Where your house is could be like a millimeter too low. Anyway, so it's never going to be possible, but you hope to encapsulate to higher and higher accuracy with finer and finer precision as time goes on. Unlike mathematics, Fermat's last theorem will never be unproven. Pythagorean theorem will never be unproven. No one will ever come up, I discovered there's on Venus inside of a wind cave. It's not possible. And so I find it very interesting that, for example, I was mentioning these Messianic Jews that I interacted with, 4 or 5 of them, including a professor at the Weizmann Institute, Tony Futterman, in Israel, who was, talk about being on, I don't want to say enemy ground, but he's a Jew for Jesus, is what that means. We used to call them that, but now they call him Messianic Jew. And I interviewed all these guys, including one, Professor James Tour of Rice University, who is perhaps the most, passionate Christian, but he was born Jewish. And he's got incredible, scientific bona fides, far in excess of what I have. But I asked all these people, I said the very simple thing: do you ever doubt your faith? And I asked Christians this too, not just Jews for Jesus, but ask, born from birth Christians. You ever doubt your faith? Because I doubt my faith all the time. I don't know about you guys, but I doubt it all the time. I mean, that's the whole question of theodicy. Good things happen to bad people, bad things happen to good people. I don't know which is more annoying. But the point being, that's kind of like a hallmark. Like, otherwise God makes, and all these Messianic Jews to a man said, no, I never doubt it. And I couldn't grasp it. I could not understand.
It's a cognitive dissonance, it's like, because you're a scientist.
Yeah.
And Rabbi Sachs, also, just to bring him up again, he said, faith is the courage to live with uncertainty. That's what it's all about. It's the
That's
struggle.
right.
Yeah.
And you're telling me, like we say before, like Dennis Prager has become a good friend and a mentor in many ways to me. He says something like, of course I'm going to see, God forbid, Has v'shalom, Kanai, whatever, poo, kill the evil eye. Always do it, make sure you always do that. The poo-poo-poos, always do that an odd number of times. Otherwise, it's a double negative. The Kanai scientists have recently discovered will come and get you if you just do poo-poo. Don't just do poo-poo.
You're talking to the wrong crowd over here. We're rationalists. We're not into that stuff. That's a super.
Okay, good. I'll tell you your horoscopes later. You guys want your horoscopes? I know you asked an astronomer on for a reason. Anyway, but Dennis Prager says, look, I doubt all the time. You see it, God forbid, a baby born with cancer dies. You're telling me you never see like a healthy baby, born and think like that's a miracle? Like, you just told me, atheist person, that you can't believe in God because, these bad things happen to good people or innocent people. But like, what about the 99 point? The reason that it's aberrant is because it almost never happens, thankfully. So I find looking for ways to bolster as I said, these Amuna vitamins. There's so many of them, and there's no need to be non-rational about them. I mean, there's millions and millions of ways if you want to see it. But I think a lot of scientists don't want to see it. They don't want to believe it. And I could say the same thing. I mean, I'm not perfect, right? I mean, I always say, look, Rabbi Orlovsky would always say things like, don't look for a perfect man, ladies. My wife got the last one. I am not perfect by any means. But when you look at, what you attempt to do, and are you trying to, evade the yoke of the mitzvot, or are you trying to, if you have to ask yourself, honestly, why am I behaving the way I am? And do an inventory on yourselves. But in so doing, you also have to give yourself credit for what you're doing, for the fact that you're doing behaviors, whether or not, and you guys admitted it, and I have, kol hakavod, and I admit it too, I doubt my faith all the time, especially at like, 6 in the morning, I don't want to get up and I have to take the kids to school or daven or whatever, but that's when the Yetzer Hara strikes, right? But at the same time, overcoming that is being on the path, I should say, to try to always overcome it. I don't think you can ever believe in God, by the way. I don't even think like my rabbi believes in God. Like, in other words, not to say, Has v'shalom, something bad could happen like Job, but to say like belief in God is like being happy. Have you ever been happy? Yeah, I've been happy. And then like 2 seconds later, my car got a ticket, right? So you can become happy, right? You can work on it's like climbing a mountain. You never get to the top of the mountain. You just get more and more because there's so many. Let me put it this way. Let's say you're perfectly happy. Let me ask you guys, how could I make your life, Ben? I'll just because we only have so much time. Ben, how could I double your happiness right now? How could I double your happiness?
By getting Dennis Prager, Ben Shapiro, and Lex Friedman on my podcast. And
okay, well, that as long as that's not forbidden by the laws of quantum mechanics, it could happen, right? So let's say that would double your happiness. Let me ask you, Godfrey, do you have kids? Are you married? I don't know. You do. Okay. So any parent, I brought this up to Lex when I was on a show. So any parent can think of not a way to become half as happy, but to become infinitely impoverished, devoid, sorrowful, miserable, right? And I'm not even going to say it because I don't like to think about it. So that means in statistical terms, there's an infinite number of ways to make yourself infinitely unhappy, right? Just all the different ways it could be unhappy, but there's only like one way, according to Ben, that can make him twice as happy, right? So that tells you, like, it's much easier to be unhappy, and yet you're happy. You guys have a very happy countenances. I like that. I love your show. So the fact that you are means that you're resisting, defeating the entropic forces that are trying to make you unhappy and to make you not believe in God. Just like there's a million ways for you not to believe in God, right? But you don't. You do. You attempt and you pursue it. And I think that's the key thing. That's what, if anything, God is looking at with me. It's, do you find time, to increase and bolster your approach to believing in God? Not to believe in God. That's like, check, you can't have scientific proof, but you can approach it.
The journey
Love
is
it.
the journey is the goal.
The pursuit.
That's right, 100%.
So we only have a few more minutes, so maybe we can do the rest of the questions rapid fire, and you can kind of give us.
Okay, yeah, let's do the rapid fire.
So I wanted to mention that the opening sentence of the Torah talks about God is not the world. The building blocks of creation and Bereshit are, Shamayim, which is space, Aretz is matter, and Bereshit is time. So from a scientific perspective, how are space and time related, and why is it such a fundamental question?
On one foot.
On one foot.
Say our space and time related?
Yes.
So space and time are intimately intertwined in the same way that, say, let's just focus on space for a second. So if you move, let's just say you move, right? You're moving through space, and there's no absolute space, coordinate system, right? I mean, where are you guys right now? Are you in New York or?
Yeah, Great Neck, New York.
Great Neck, New York. Okay, wonderful place. I'm from Stony Brook, so okay.
Nice.
So you're moving in space, but like the street system over there in Great Neck is not like a universal coordinate system that they're using over in Davos at the World Economic Forum, right? It's useless to you, right? But your local coordinate system, let's say you move. You could also map onto some coordinate system in Switzerland, and you'd be moving respect to that, right? There's no universal coordinate system that describes all possible ways you can move in space. And that's also true of time, because there's no one fundamental observer. Let's leave Hashem out of it, just in scientific terms. There's no universal coordinate system that can uniformly account for all positions in all moments, which are called events. So we say that they kind of emerge, and they're locally descriptive, but there's no way to directly globally correlate them.
Okay, great.
Awesome. Okay, you had a great discussion with Dr. Avi Loeb about extraterrestrials. A lot of people want to know about aliens. So do you think that extraterrestrials exist? And if so, why have we not heard from them yet?
So the same kind of laws apply, right? I have to be consistent. So if you don't have evidence for something, you can't believe in it, right? So people want to believe in it. They want to say there's so many stars with so many planets, which is true. There's probably over 10 billion planets that are just like the Earth in some sense throughout the universe. But the question that Fermi asked many decades ago is, where are they if there's so many places for them to be? And I like to point out, as I described in my first book, in Losing the Nobel Prize, that's the South Pole in Antarctica over here, if you're watching on YouTube. That's the South Pole. That's the bottom of the world, right? From one coordinate system. It's totally frozen, totally flat. When I was there, I was like, I think I might have been the fattest person on the whole continent. In other words, there's so few people on the continent. A little bit. I could stand to lose some pounds. I had to bring some self-heating La Bruyute kosher meals with me. It wasn't so easy. But when you're there, you could be. I was the first person to put on tefillin. I was the only person putting on tefillin at the South Pole. I was the only person who ever spun a dreidel at the South Pole. It was like all these crazy things, right? But that's because there's so few people there. It wasn't because I'm so great, right? But if you ask the same question, like, Antarctica is 1/7 of all the continents on Earth, and yet there's no life there, right? You're not going to find a shul there. You're not going to get a minion down there, right? So just because there's a high probability, there's a lot of surface area and life could exist there, doesn't mean life does. So I think there is, almost no way to tell the difference between a probability of 1 in a trillion that life does exist and actual, zero chance for life. Of course, I would never say there's no life in the universe. It's clear that if there is life, it's not nearby to us in terms of its technological capabilities. In other words, it could be a dolphin on, Proxima Centauri B's planet, but we never know about it because it's swimming through the water. So from that standpoint, Avi and I differ in his kind of belief that the universe is fecund and full of life, and it's kind of like the Garden of Eden everywhere. I think it's much less probable. I think there's almost no other life in the universe, and if there is, it might have come from the Earth, spreading out to the rest of the solar system and beyond. But again, we have no evidence for that either. So right now, I have to say we don't think there is. There could be, but currently we have no evidence for it.
And one last quick question: Is mathematics something that we discover? Are they hardwired and built into the universe, or we're just using it to like kind of create an understanding of how to navigate the world?
I think, mathematics has been said as the greatest labor-saving tool ever invented by human beings. The question that I usually get asked is it invented? Does math come from a mind, or does it get discovered? Like you discover some new continent or something like that. And I think the answer is both. There are things that we discover where things come from the physical world, like calculus. Good old Yitzhak Newton. He discovered the laws of motion, laws of gravity, et cetera, et cetera. And then to describe them, he had to invent something called calculus, which, is the bane of any, 11th grader's existence. So, although I happen to love it and find it quite beautiful. So, in that token, it was kind of deduced scientifically from the physical world. On the other hand, there are things like integers. Like you cannot give me a triangle. There's no way, there's no physical instantiation. Triangles only exist in the human brain, as far as we know. There's no way, even a computer cannot accurately predict 3 zero-dimensional points. And yet we can manipulate them. The same thing about infinity. No computer can grasp what infinity is. The human brain does it all the time. So we can make approximations towards what mathematical objects are based on deductive extrapolation from what we see and observe in the physical world. But then there'll be some things that we can't ever encounter in the physical world because our senses of experience don't permit that. High dimensional spaces, even the fourth dimension, we can only make analogies to. So for all those reasons, I say, math is a tool. It's also an almost artistic creation of sublime, unparalleled beauty when you understand it. The problem is a lot of people have like math phobia, but I never see anybody have art phobia. I'm looking at the painting behind you. That looks like a nice little work of art over there. Nobody's like, don't ask me to look at art. Like I'm not an art person. No, I might not be able to play music, but I can, except on Spotify, but I can appreciate music even though I can't play it. Same should be true about science. And I wish that more people would do it because it is, if God leaves clues, science and math are the probably most direct ways to take that, Amuna penicillin and strengthen it.
Oh, yeah. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Keating. We really appreciate you making the time. We hope we can do this again. And
pleasure.
I'm going to send you a copy very shortly. Thank you so much.
I really enjoyed it, guys. Kol hakavod, and I hope to do it again, and maybe in person when I come out to the East Coast again.
Let us know.
Amazing. Take care.
All right, guys. Take care. Be well.
Bye-bye.
Bye.